Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. Have you heard me talk about this platform for yoga teachers? I absolutely love this company, and one of the reasons is that they understand what yoga teachers are going through. So one of the co-founders, Alex, is a meditation teacher who struggled himself with software options at the studio he was working at. So if you are wanting to build a website, schedule classes, and share your offerings online, everything from courses to memberships, make sure to head over to offeringtree.com/Shannon for a special discount. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. Today, I'm still practicing how to share my social location thanks to our podcast with Rauda, which was episode 266. Make sure to head back there and have a listen if you're new to social location and sharing that. My home that I own here is on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also known as the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. I'm a citizen here, which means I have healthcare that is paid for when I need it. I'm really understanding this privilege as I'm booking some travel healthcare insurance this week. I'm a cisgender middle-class woman living in a white, average-size, able body. I speak English, I went to college, my family has a history of mental health issues, so I make sure to make therapy a priority. One of the biggest things that I'm learning as I practice this social location is that it helps me to see where I really hold privilege, and it reminds me to look at how I can work to make things more equitable in the spaces I'm in, here on the podcast, out in the yoga world, and in my own community. So I just want to say thanks for being here with me on this journey. I might shorten my intro. I've been looking at, okay, this is taking up some space and my listeners already know me and I don't do a full intro in every single episode. And it's interesting just to acknowledge and notice the thoughts that are going on in my head as I practice sharing my social location. I've also been sharing some random facts, and today really relates to my very first yoga teacher training. So it was in Toronto, which is 3 hours from my home here on the Bruce Peninsula. And I traveled all that way to Toronto to study with Satdaram Kaur. Shout out to her. She's an amazing human, amazing teacher, also a naturopathic doctor in our area. And I traveled all this way to find out that Satdaram was actually from Owen Sound, which is 20 minutes from my home. So for a whole year, I traveled to Toronto each and every month and really gained a lot from that training. And it was just a quirky thing the first weekend, finding out, that she's from Owen Sound, so close to me. And we were all traveling to Toronto. I'm also a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you are connected to information and inspiration that is going to support you on the day-to-day happenings of being a yoga teacher and an entrepreneur. I know what it feels like. It is not an easy road to take to be an entrepreneur. And there's a lot to learn as a yoga teacher. For instance, today's topic, how many times have you told someone that you teach yoga only to have them turn around and say to you, oh, I can't do yoga, or yoga isn't for me because I'm not bendy or I'm not flexible enough? This happens to me a lot out in the world, and it's because yoga poses that we often see in magazines or on Instagram depict a sort of contortionist style of yoga, which many of you know because you're yoga teachers. This isn't the true essence of yoga, but it's definitely the brand that yoga holds out in the world for someone who's brand new to yoga or hasn't taken a yoga class. And sometimes a more flexible person is told, oh, you should do yoga because you're so flexible. You'll be really good at it. So it's kind of like what comes first here, the chicken or the egg. Are more flexible people drawn to yoga, or when we practice yoga, does it make us more flexible? And we're going to talk about this today in the podcast. along with, what about hypermobility in this conversation? I had a lot of questions for Libby, our guest today, because she specializes in hypermobility and yoga. Libby Hinsley just wrote a book about all of this called Yoga for Bendy People, which is coming out right away soon. If you're listening to this podcast now in real time, you can head over to Libby's website and actually sign up and get notified when it's released. Libby knows this topic also on a very personal level. She has been diagnosed with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, and she'll talk about that more today. She's a physical therapist and a yoga therapist, and at her clinical practice, she specializes in treating hypermobility disorders and yoga-related injuries. She's also someone to follow if you love learning about anatomy and how the body works. Libby has a membership program called Anatomy Bites, and we'll make sure to link to that as well in our show notes. This interview is packed with so much information that I wish I knew as a newer yoga teacher. It would have saved me from some injuries and from some cues that were just steeped in misinformation. But here we are today, learning as we go. Let's dive in and learn together from Libby. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Libby. It's so great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to have this conversation with you.
I am so glad that we get to talk about yoga and hypermobility because this is something that comes up all the time in the Connected Yoga Teacher group. It comes up in yoga teacher trainings. It comes up in yoga classes all over. But before we get there, tell us first, what is the work that you do and what's the work that you've been doing lately on your book?
Okay, so I'm a physical therapist, but I was a yoga teacher first. And my teaching yoga is kind of what led me into physical therapy. And I've been a PT now for 10 years, and I'm a yoga therapist as well. And I specialize in treating hypermobility disorders and hypermobility syndromes. And a part of that is because in my clinical practice of treating primarily injured yogis and injured yoga teachers, turns out they all have hypermobility, or a great many of them do. And then over the last few years, I actually discovered that I actually have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. So like my whole personal and professional worlds just have brought me into this real focus on hypermobility, understanding these conditions, understanding how to treat them. And so in the last year, I've been writing a book about it, and it's called Yoga for Bendy People. And it hopefully will kind of push the needle on the quality of conversation that we're having about hypermobility in the yoga community and help shed some light on what is actually a pretty complicated topic. Might help give some direction to teachers, all teachers, as well as practitioners who have hypermobility.
That's amazing. Can you define for us what is hypermobility? Let's start there.
Yeah, so hypermobility is just a word that describes a joint's ability to move more than is normal. So for every joint in the body, we have normal ranges of motion that have been established based on, how normal humans move. And hypermobility just describes someone who moves more. You can have that in just a couple joints. You can have that in a whole lot of joints. There are a lot of ways to have hypermobility. And the thing is, it's not pathological in and of itself. So there are a few different things that could lead someone to have joints that move more than is normal, bigger ranges of motion. It could be the shape of your bones and the way that the particular bones come together. But when we get into situations where hypermobility is caused by a genetic difference in connective tissue, that is when it's more likely to be symptomatic and problematic. And that's when we start to call it a hypermobility syndrome. Okay. And so that has to do with a difference in the structure and or function of collagen fibers in the body. And all of those collagenous connective tissues, tendons, ligaments, fascia, joint capsules are made largely out of collagen. And so when you have, I'm just going to call it sort of floppy collagen, floppy connective tissues, then you don't get that support from your passive structures. And so that starts to create some problems, not just musculoskeletal problems, but actually a whole wide array of symptoms across a lot of systems of the body.
And then you said that you've been diagnosed with, what did you call it?
Yeah, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. So that is one of many conditions where hypermobility is a feature. So when we say hypermobility syndrome, that's kind of a generic term to just describe some condition where there's hypermobility and there's symptoms associated with it. And a couple of the most common ones are hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. Now, Ehlers-Danlos is a bigger umbrella of 14 different subtypes. And they're all, most of them are pretty rare conditions. But the one that is not rare at all is hypermobile type. And it's not a rare condition, but it's not well understood genetically yet. And it's also massively underdiagnosed. And so that is one diagnosis of hypermobility syndrome. And then another one that looks almost identical to it, but that doesn't meet all the specific criteria for diagnosis, is called hypermobility spectrum disorder. And that's a more general kind of term to describe people who are symptomatic and are bendy and have a wide range of symptoms that we can get into if you'd like, but that don't really meet that criteria for that Ehlers-Danlos. And there's a lot of confusion between those things. And it's because it is confusing, honestly, it's very confusing. But the thing I want to drive home is that, if someone has hypermobility and they have a bunch of symptoms, it doesn't really matter what the label is. The symptoms are what, we're dealing with. And I really believe yoga can be a powerful tool to improve the quality of life for people who have hypermobility. Whatever their label is, or if they don't ever get a label, we can talk about the pros and cons of that as well. But hypermobility spectrum disorder is not a lesser diagnosis than hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. That is often a misconception. They're just different labels.
Thank you for clarifying that. And so I know over the years as a yoga teacher, different people, I would see people, let's say not even in a yoga class, I'd just be somewhere where someone was demonstrating flexibility or maybe hypermobility, and someone else might comment and say, oh my gosh, you're so bendy, you should go to yoga. So what are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. That is exactly the thing that sets us up for this conundrum we're in yoga, like a yoga culture that continues to really glorify and praise and kind of reward, with positive feedback, people who are just genetically hypermobile. And it turns out a lot of those people are struggling with a whole lot of different challenges that, it creates this bit of confusion. And I've lived that for many years where people are like, wow, you're so good at yoga, just because you can kind of get your body into these shapes. And inside I'm going, but I'm so confused because my body hurts all the time and I'm having all these other issues. And how am I good at yoga? I just don't understand. I remember being confused about that, 20 years ago when I was taking yoga classes. There's a disconnect with what we consider it means to be good at yoga is very much tied to an aesthetic that glorifies hypermobility. And it's a problem. Yeah. Not only is it a problem because it kind of encourages bendy people to exploit that because they're getting positive feedback for it, but it also is intimidating for just your normal human bodies who might really benefit from yoga, but feel intimidated because then they don't think they're good at yoga. Right. So it's like across the whole board, I think it's unfortunate. But you mentioned flexibility and hypermobility. Flexibility and mobility are two different terms. And I want to just clarify those real quick because they're often used interchangeably. And, the definitions of those terms are really going to depend on who you ask. So like if there's a research article or a book written and people are talking about these things, my hope is that they just define their terms well because they're not always defined the same way. So just like to put that out there. But in the hypermobility world, what I see most commonly is that a flexibility is determined by like the tone of your nervous system and the stretchiness of your muscles to allow range of motion to happen at a joint. Whereas mobility is really talking about the joint itself, the mobility that the collagenous connective tissues allow, like the joint capsule and the ligaments and the tendons. So the mobility really has to do with joints and it doesn't have to do so much with muscles. Okay, so what's tricky about this is that a lot of hypermobile people whose joints move a lot, who have floppy connective tissue, that's kind of the term we'll go with, floppiness, they have really tight muscles.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It is. And that tension in their muscles is very often their pain driver. It is really a big piece of, their symptomology in their musculoskeletal stuff.
Can you give us some information as to why the muscles are so tight then?
Yeah, there are a few different reasons. Okay, so if we step back and kind of look at, all right, there are muscles and then there's connective tissue, all right? And those are never really separate, right? So in a muscle, every muscle cell is surrounded by a layer of fascia. Every bundle of muscle cells, fascia. Every muscle belly, fascia. Okay, there are layers and layers and layers of fascia in a muscle unit, and those layers of fascia actually are continuous with the tendon, which is continuous with the bone. And so this collagenous connective tissue is intermingled with muscle tissue. You can't separate them out, but even though they're made of different stuff. And so we could think of that as passive and active parts of the kind of myofascial system or the musculoskeletal system. Passive parts are non-contractile parts, or at least minimally contractile. Because there's some fun stuff about fibroblasts that are the cells that make collagen. Turns out fibroblasts are actually contractile, and it's mind-blowing and crazy. But anyway, they actually make collagen, and they make all of the other components of connective tissue as well. But at any rate, let's talk about those as passive, because they're less contractile or very minimally contractile, where the active ones, the muscles, are contractile. All right, so we have this mix of active and passive structures that support mobility and movement and strength and all the things, our movement. Well, when you have a passive structure that's floppy, that doesn't hold tension, it doesn't hold the necessary tension to transmit forces across joints, to integrate movement, like, the tension of your passive connective tissues is how it provides integrity to your system. Okay, it's called tensegrity. And it's a cool concept. It's like integrity of this body actually comes from a tensional system. And so when the floppy passive structures can't hold tension, can't support you, then your active structures have to really bump it up, and they have to work double time to provide that stability. And so those muscles are contracting all the time just to try to hold you together, because it's actually collagen's job to hold you together. It's the glue of the body. And when it's not quite up to the task because of its difference genetically, then the active structures are really having to compensate a lot. So you get a lot of muscle fatigue and a lot of overcontraction. So that's one reason. But then there are other reasons too. And one of them has to do with the status of the bendy person's nervous system. So hypermobile people tend to have nervous systems, autonomic nervous systems, that live in a sympathetic state. They're kind of in sympathetic overdrive. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them may be that they tend to have larger amygdala. They have different brain structures, and the amygdala is part of the brain that is really involved with a fear and stress response. And there's some cool research that shows bendy people actually have enlarged amygdala. And so that may be related to this sympathetic overdrive. So that's one thing. And they tend to have a lot of anxiety and kind of like a hypervigilant nervous system. That equals muscle tension for anybody. Yeah, so we've got a couple different things compounding on each other that create a situation of bendiness and a feeling of tightness, a feeling of tension. And I always say, the classic image of the hypermobile yogi is the person dropping into a split or in some really deep posture, complaining about how tight she is. And I've seen it so many times, and it's really like visually so weird. It's like, wow, this person is doing this amazing, like really difficult thing. But while they're there, they're talking about how tight they feel. And that's it.
This is fascinating. And it's bringing up a lot of questions for me, because I feel like the general message, and we know that general messages don't work with individual people, but the general message I usually hear is, okay, if you're hypermobile, the one and only answer, and I'm exaggerating this, is to strengthen your muscles. But this doesn't really go along with what you're saying if the muscles are holding a pile of tension.
Well, they're holding a pile of tension, but they really want to be stronger. So what's another sort of counterintuitive mind twist about muscle tension is that very often muscles are tense in response to instability or in response to relative weakness. And as those muscles get stronger, they get less tense. Because tension isn't like a measure of strength. It's a dysfunction in a tension kind of way. So a tense muscle doesn't contract well. It doesn't yield well. Okay, it's just kind of contracting all the time. And so a lot of its contractile power is used up all the time. So I get so tired and it gets, chemically irritated because muscles that are contracting all the time don't get good blood flow. And then they kind of build up this, what I call a painful chemical soup, in the local tissues that is irritating, and that increases our pain. And so it's this whole cycle of events. So yes, strength training is the number one best friend for bendy people from now on forever. But that's not the only thing that can help them. But it is important. And I always do recommend it, strength training and stability training.
Okay, this is so good. Thank you for explaining that, because my brain all of a sudden was like, wait, is this the right thing to do? So what do we do then if we think that we might be hypermobile? Who do we go see? Do we stop going to yoga? Do we stop trying to do yoga poses? What are some of the things you tell people to do?
Well, if someone thinks that they might be hypermobile and have some symptoms related to it, I guess I can describe some of the most common symptoms just to see if it's, rings bells for people. Because very often people are walking around with kind of chronic nagging things that they've never really connected the dots about. But what's a classic presentation of someone with a hypermobility syndrome would be musculoskeletal stuff, including either joint dislocations or subluxations, like joints that just kind of don't quite stay in place. Labral tears are pretty common in the shoulders and the hips. The biggest one is going to be sacroiliac joint pain. That's I've almost never seen a bendy person who doesn't have that. It's really hard to find a person with a syndrome that doesn't have SI joint pain. Patellofemoral pain is really common. Pelvic organ prolapse is really super common. Hernia, abdominal hernias, things like that. So those would be, and muscle pain, fibromyalgia. Actually, there's some research that shows up to 70% of people who have a fibromyalgia diagnosis have joint hypermobility. And it's so prevalent. Hypermobility is so prevalent in people with fibromyalgia that a lot of experts in this field kind of have started to think that fibromyalgia may be actually a misdiagnosis. And actually what's going on is this bigger connective tissue thing. So that's an example. So myofascial pain and all the other stuff. And then the other pieces that often go along with it that also lead people to yoga practice for really good reason is this hypervigilant nervous system, this really high prevalence of anxiety and ADHD, and a stronger post-traumatic stress response. Really just all of those, pieces that reflect a very heightened sympathetic tone and nervous system dysregulation. And so that's very commonly a piece of it. And then the other parts are a lot of digestive issues like irritable bowel or even just food sensitivities. That's really common because the gut lining is actually made largely of collagen. And so where there's collagen, there's some impairment, there's some floppiness, and the tight gap junctions that, line your gut, they're not tight. They're kind of wobbly and loose. And so there's a propensity for leaky gut. And then there's also a really common comorbidity of mast cell activation disorders, which is where you have a strong histamine response. People break out into rashes and hives really easily, or they're very sensitive to adhesives and they get rashy and itchy. Sometimes even with heated yoga that, might stimulate that. And then there's dizziness. And the dizziness usually has to do with some autonomic dysfunction called dysautonomia. Dysautonomia is problems with the blood pressure and heart rate regulation. And so a lot of bendy people get dizzy, and it's because in orthostatic, or they have a hard time being upright. So there's orthostatic difficulty. And when they stand up, their heart rate goes way up, and or their blood pressure goes way down. So one of those things. And those are all the most common kind of spread of symptoms that people very often would have no reason to think are connected, but they are. They're all part of the syndrome.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I would think with that huge list, you wouldn't be tying them all back to this. It's also making me wonder how many people are walking around that are hypermobile, and is it, I guess you explained this at the beginning, like not always is it an issue.
It's not always an issue. It's really not always a problem. And the prevalence of it is really hard to estimate, and different studies put it at different places. But, the largest prevalence I've seen is an estimate of 20%, but, of the general population. That's a lot. That's a lot. But, are all those people symptomatic? Do they all have a hypermobility syndrome? I don't know. It's just so hard to say, because it isn't well understood and it's not well diagnosed. And I think a ton of people are walking around with undiagnosed hypermobility spectrum disorder or hypermobile EDS. And a lot of them are at yoga. I think hypermobility is way overrepresented in yoga compared to the regular population, just because, it's nice to feel successful at an activity. And again, there are a lot of physical kind of challenges and mental health challenges that may lead someone to yoga for really good reasons. And yoga has a lot to offer this population. It's just that when we get into yoga, if we're practicing in a way that really emphasizes just increasing mobility to no end, like our verbal cues, our assists, everything about yoga so commonly pushes people to go as far as they can in a posture as if that's the goal. And that is not going to be helpful for a hypermobile person. A hypermobile person, needs to back away from the edge, just don't go to the edge. Stay away from it, and kind of put into place some different principles of practice so that the practice actually is designed to be very supportive of this person. So often when we're talking about hypermobility in yoga, we kind of hone in on, okay, well, how can the bendy person keep practicing asana in the same way, which is very, still very popular stuff, this fast-paced, power, fitness-oriented, sweaty. How can we keep doing that with less injury? All right. And that's a great conversation. I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of decreasing injury. But it's not that interesting of a conversation to me. I think there's a much bigger one to be had, which is, okay, let's make the practice about the practitioner, right? Instead of trying to push this practitioner into this certain type of practice, let's just build a practice that is actually for this person, that's about this person, and that really supports that person. So that's what my book is aiming to do, to lay out what are the principles of practice that, not only don't injure these people, but actually really helps them to have better body awareness. That's one of the things I didn't mention for proprioception, better body mapping, brain and body communication, better motor control, better stability, better regulation, better focus, better connection to your heart's purpose, like all these different elements, and better self-care. So I have a whole chapter on yama and niyama as guidelines for self-care for anyone living with a chronic health condition. But all those are relevant to the bendy practitioner, not just, how to micro bend your elbows so you don't hyperextend. I mean, how long are we going to talk about that? Cool, but let's go way beyond that.
Hey, Connected Yoga teachers, I'm popping in here quick because I wanted to share some feedback from Carly, a yoga teacher who is using OfferingTree for her website. Many of our listeners have already heard about OfferingTree, this amazing all-in-one platform for yoga teachers and wellness professionals. And many are asking, what does a website look like? using OfferingTree. So I wanted to share in the show notes today a link to Carly's website. And because you're probably on the go and busy right now, I want to share what Carly said when asked about using OfferingTree.
Well, for years, there's always been this hovering, I should get a website. People don't know how to find me if they look me up after a class. There's nowhere to go. But I just never knew where to start. And I've never built a website before. And it's just something that was easy for me to just keep putting off. And when I got serious about doing this, go it alone, well, how am I going to do it? I have Zoom. So I looked into it and I was considering other options. And it was kind of that mixed with taking the plunge of going out alone. It felt very risky at the time. And there I am, because they let you kind of build it first, see how it looks before you press the button. And there I was talking to my husband, like, am I just going to be throwing away this investment of money to commit to this for a year when I don't even know if anybody's going to show up? And I made my money back within 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Carly. So, connected yoga teachers, if you are thinking about trying out OfferingTree, you can go to our show notes, theconnectedyogateacher.com/270, and look for the link to Carly's website, which is radicalrestyoga.com. And remember that you can also try this out for 14 days for free. And all of our listeners can use our special discount code, which is offeringtree.com/Shannon. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing, Carly. Your website looks amazing. I actually just signed up to get your emails because your freebie caught my eye. I love the name of it. It's called 10-Minute Tension Tamer. I plan to have a listen to it after sitting at my desk so much today. Okay, connected yoga teachers, let's get back into our interview with Libby. This is fascinating. Okay, so we'll definitely add your book to our list, I think, for all yoga teachers and quite possibly all yoga practitioners. I feel like it sounds like we could all gain something from it. So what are some of the components in your book where you think, you know what, these pieces really help to, like, I love what you said, to support the practitioner instead of making the person fit into the yoga practice. Let's make the yoga practice fit that person. What are some of the things that you've learned about?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the biggest mindset shift. So I have, talk a lot about just mindset. What's yoga for? We have to step back and ask that. And you're right. This is for all yoga teachers, this book, to reflect on what is it we're practicing for? What's this whole thing about? And we so easily miss that, or we kind of forget that in our quest for fitness type yoga stuff. We can kind of just miss the ball completely. So coming back to that and making the practice less about the practice and more about the practitioner, what we come up with is basic principles like smaller movements. And part of, backing away from the edge that I mentioned is an interesting sort of debate or conversation about range of motion. So the thing is, when you have a lot of range of motion at a joint, it's not entirely true that the range of motion is really bad, like you should never go there. Now, some people, to go to their edge, they'll dislocate a joint. Okay, well, let's not ever go there, right? We don't want that. But the bigger issue is that it's very difficult to control your movement through that large of a range. That's the real issue here. And especially with hypermobile people, they tend to not be so great at motor control, which is steady movement throughout a range. They don't have great proprioception and they don't have great joint stability through a range. So the way we cultivate that is to back up and do smaller movements and cultivate good motor control here in a smaller range. And then we, over time, maybe we increase the range, but not at the expense of the motor control. Okay, so smaller movements is a really big piece. My philosophy on it is that the range actually is a problem. There's no benefit in going to your end range. If you're hypermobile, you'll never lack range of motion. There's no risk. You know what I mean? You'll always have more than other humans, and you don't need to go there. And it's going to be more problematic for you probably than helpful. Now, that's different if you're actually a circus performer. Then right? Like if your vocation requires you to train stability in that range, that makes sense. But if you're a yoga practitioner, that doesn't make sense, because yoga doesn't care about your range of motion, right? That is not a goal of yoga. It's a goal of circus arts. So I think there are a lot of reasons to just back off in smaller movements. That's one principle. The other one is slower movements. We have got to slow it down, because slower movements give you a chance to practice motor control. Like that is, you have to work so much harder as a bendy person to move slowly through a range than, flinging yourself around with momentum. Momentum is easy. That's not a problem. It's the control that's hard. And it's like, oh, it's really hard for bendy people to slow down. They're like, this is hard. Like, I know. Isn't that awesome? And so that's where it's at. It also gives us a chance to pay attention and to start getting the information from the body about how it actually feels to move. Because that's the other piece I didn't mention. There's so many pieces of it, is that bendy people have a hard time discerning and interpreting the information, like the cues that their body is giving them. And that's why they're so prone to overdo it, to go too far, to overdo it. And then they're not sure they're doing that in the moment because they don't get the information, but then they feel it the next day, right? And so slowing down helps us to start to listen to more subtle cues in the body, that the body's communicating to us about what's going on in the body. And we have to really focus, because that's a challenge for bendy people. It's a challenge for the way that our brains are and the way they're wired up to talk with the body. We have to practice that. And it's common that a bendy person doesn't really feel anything until like it hits them over the head. It's like, so we need to start noticing the cues before we get to that point.
These are so good. And as you're saying this, what's popping into my brain are the moments as a yoga teacher watching someone in class really fling their leg or their arm over and then look at you like, yeah, what else do you have? This, I'm not feeling anything in this, or exactly. I can do this, and bringing them back to those smaller, slower movements is where I always went with them then. And it was hard then for them to do that.
It is hard to do that. And there's, someone has to be interested in doing that. But again, it depends on why are they at yoga? And at what point are they going to kind of shift their focus and be willing to integrate mind and body? That's essentially what we're talking about. Right? Rather than flinging yourself around, like sort of having this out of body experience, get your awareness in the body and start to feel it. That's the project for the bendy person, but you have to be willing, and it is not easy. It's not sexy the way that.
Do you have anything that you talk to yoga students or your PT clients about when they're dealing with hypermobility? And it's prevalent in different places where we look. Like being bendy is cool, especially in yoga spaces. So is there anything that you tell them to convince them of this that would be kind of quick and get them on board? Like, this is going to feel better.
Yeah, I just tell them, when you change the way you're practicing, you're going to feel better. And so it's either there's like this crossroads that the bendy yogi gets to, and I'm talking about the person who's been symptomatic and is really having challenges. And this was me for 10 years. I was in daily pain directly related to my yoga practice. So I get it. I have absolutely been there, and I would never have changed my practice until I was ready to. So I get it. Have compassion for that. But so there's this crossroads, and I tell people, you just decide, do you want to look cool in yoga, or do you want to feel better? And that's it. And you get to make that choice, and you can make it now, or you can make it in 10 years. Like, in my case, I waited a long time to make that decision, and I suffered a lot along the way. What were they horrible injuries? No, but they made life less awesome. like they were daily nagging things that didn't need to be happening. So that's the crossroads. And, I always just ask people to reflect, what is it about? Why are you practicing yoga? And I remind people your yoga practice is actually for you. And that usually really kind of wakes people up a bit, like, oh, you mean this isn't a performance for someone else? This is actually for me, and it's for my life. It's about my life, and that's what yoga wants this to be, for you, and to lead you to a, more easeful, purposeful life.
I love this so much. I love the yoga's for you. And the question, do you want to look cool or do you want to feel better? That's a great question. I know what it feels like to have an ego and be in a yoga class and think, oh, look at that person over there. I wonder if I could move like that or bend like that. I get it. So
totally.
Yeah.
I was that person. Like I said, for years, I would show up to yoga class in my, sacroiliac support belt with shredded shoulders. I mean, I would not skip a chaturanga. I really was that person. So I do have great compassion for that. And I'm also very grateful that I was able to turn it around, that I was introduced to a way of practicing yoga, 12 years ago or so, that really changed things for me, and that has made my life better.
Is there anything that you've been learning about as you write this book, as you do this research, as you work with people, where you're like, wow, this is amazing, or wow, I wish I would have known this much earlier on?
Oh, all of it. All of it I wish I had known so much sooner, because my life would have made much more sense for the past 20 years. I just was diagnosed about 2 years ago with EDS, and now my whole life makes more sense. And the dots are connected, and I feel validated. One of the things I talk about in the book is just my story, my path towards diagnosis, and the kind of funny relationship we have with diagnosis in general. And understandably, people want to avoid that labeling, because sometimes it leads to limitations or to a narrative about, I can't XYZ. And I talk about how liberating and validating it was for me to be diagnosed, because I finally sat down with a geneticist. And after seeing countless people right over the years, countless people who just never understood, never really were able to validate. When I sat down with that geneticist, he was like, oh, this is a classic case of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. And like the feeling that I had when he said that, and he understood, and he wasn't thinking, maybe I'm a little crazy, or maybe I'm making this up, or da-da-da-da-da. I just can't put words to how powerful that was, and how much it has liberated me as far as like moving forward with life in new ways. I don't see it as a limitation at all. So, and that was kind of surprising, but so much of the research for the book has been, continues to be validating and enlightening. And just, my hope with the book is that it saves some people from some of the confusion and the wondering that I spent so many years doing, wondering, is this how everyone feels? Like, is this how fatigued everyone is? Because chronic fatigue is usually a part of it too. Just that wondering, you just don't know what other people's experience is like. So that's been really nice. And earlier on, you asked, what should someone do if they suspect they may have a hypermobility syndrome? So I mentioned a geneticist. Seeing a medical geneticist could be one thing, but just ask your doctor about it, and the problem is there aren't a lot of medical practitioners who have a lot of awareness about these things. So that's a challenge. But hopefully you find one who's open to learning, and helping you to find resources, and you build a team of practitioners who can help. Physical therapy is often sort of at the forefront, because a lot of the musculoskeletal symptoms are what really catches people's attention. And, having a PT who understands hypermobility is important, because there's often some differences in exercise tolerance, and recovery and nutritional needs and all that kind of stuff. People often get, they'll say, well, I'm trying to do strength training, but I get so sore. Yeah, they get extra sore. And that's part of why they have to be progressed really slowly and mindfully so that they can stay with it and be comfortable with it. So all of that stuff, it would be, looking at some resources around nutrition as well. There's a lot of good resources online. Again, it can be hard to find medical practitioners who understand. And I went through the same gauntlet that so many people do. I saw a lot of specialists and well-meaning people who just didn't have it on their radar.
Right. Well, I think, oh, sorry.
No, they just kept missing it over and over.
Yeah. I think this is amazing that you then took all of this experience as a PT, as a yoga teacher, as someone who was diagnosed with hypermobility, and you're working on this book, and probably by the time this goes out, the book will be almost ready or pre-order ready. And what a gift, because you sifted through all of the information. I mean, that's a huge thing. Thank you for doing this work. And
you're welcome. I hope it's helpful to people, whether, bendy or not. As yoga teachers, I guarantee you see it all the time. And, one of the things that's so interesting about the yoga setting is that hypermobility is everywhere, and it's so common that it looks normal to people. So, that the yoga teacher who is used to visually seeing hypermobile students just comes to see that as standard human movement, and doesn't recognize that, wow, this is actually excessive human movement. So there may be some other issues here, and the yoga teacher is actually in the position to help connect some dots for people, and not in an alarmist kind of way, like, oh my God, this is really bad. It's actually not really bad. It's not bad at all. And, the injury risk is there, but again, it's like, I think it's overplayed. I think the risk of injury is overplayed around hypermobility. It's certainly there, and we need to be aware of it. But what's underplayed is how useful yoga can be for this population in terms of slowing down, smaller movements, even sequencing, how we use verbal cues, how we use hands-on assists, all of those things. It's like, it's the gold mine for bendy practitioners, actually.
Oh my gosh. That is so good to know that we don't have to say, okay, you're bendy, you can't go to yoga anymore. You just have to hang out in the gym. It's quite the opposite.
No, that's like the worst thing. That's right. Like the worst thing. But it's a place for, okay, I'm bendy. Oh, let's do some inquiry around this. Let's learn about this. And let's see, is my yoga practice right now serving me, or is it kind of like adding to my troubles? And if it's adding to my troubles, let's change it. But let's not stop practicing. Let's just practice more wisely in a way that makes you feel better and not worse.
You just said something earlier as well, and I want to come back to this because I think it's very important what you said, in that if we're a yoga teacher, we look around in a group class, we're seeing the bendiest of the population there in our class. Yeah. And then that person who walks in and is really having a hard time getting into child's pose, and you think, you really need to work on your mobility or your flexibility. And it could be that everyone else in the class is hypermobile.
Exactly. That's
quite shocking.
That's a little bit of a mind twist. It's like our perception of human movement, when all we have really observed, or most of what we've observed, is in a yoga setting, gets really skewed. And then when you start to actually just see normal humans moving, you're like, you might think, wow, they're really tight, right? Or they're really limited. But actually, they're just demonstrating what's considered normal for human bodies, and so many of our verbal cues will reflect that, where we'll say, whatever, in a pigeon pose, line up your shin parallel to the front of your mat. And, the only people who can actually do that are people with excessive hip range of motion. That's not something that normal people should be expected to do. So when you have, that whole range of human movement in your class, then the people who are more around normal range of motion, they're just like, oh, darn, I must not be good at yoga because I can't do this pose and all that. So they get really unfortunate messaging because they're not, displaying excessive range of motion.
Right. So this is really to serve all of our students, not just the hypermobile
Yes.
ones.
I think so. I think so. And I really think, hopefully the book also helps people just reflect on, what is it that our verbal cues and our language, what is it that we're encouraging, and what are we emphasizing in our teaching without maybe even realizing it? And how can we refine the language to reflect more what we understand yoga to care about, which isn't range of motion, right? The asana practice. I mean, we all know that. It's a no-brainer. Of course, you know that if you're a yoga teacher, but does your language really reflect that? Or are you still using language that encourages people to go farther? And if so, why is it better to go farther? Just why?
Yes.
What's functionally useful about going farther for anybody, right? I mean, if someone, can't get their shoes on because they're so limited, well, then yeah, we should work on that. But that's usually not the case in a yoga setting.
This is so good. Thank you for all of this today. Where do our listeners go if they want to connect with you further and order your book?
So they can go to my website, which is libbyhinsley.com. And my book depends on when this airs. So my book is called Yoga for Bendy People, and it should be available for purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc., around June or July of 2022.
Okay.
In the meantime, there's no way to pre-order it unless you happen to, hear this like now, overhear our conversation now in the next few weeks. I'm in the middle of a pre-sale campaign to pre-sell enough books to publish in a community-based publishing kind of model. So you can just search Yoga for Bendy People, and I'll have information about it on my website at libbyhinsley.com. And you can find me on Instagram, Libby Hinsley PT. That's where most of my action happens in terms of social media.
That's great. Thank you so much again, Libby. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for all of this information, Libby. I'm excited for our listeners to get a hold of your book, have a look at it, and learn more from you all about hypermobility and how this is showing up in yoga. One of the key takeaways for me was really this idea that yoga is drawing more hypermobile people, and that we see that in our classes. And the average human body is maybe not what we're seeing in our classes. Maybe we are seeing people who are more on the hypermobile end of the spectrum. So that was a big key takeaway for me for sure. And I think the other main key takeaway was how beneficial yoga can be when we're dealing with a hypermobile body, or a body that's really bendy, in your words. Thank you so much for this today. Connected Yoga Teachers, I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? Let's do a conversation inside of our Facebook group, the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group. If you're not there already, come and join us. If you're not on Facebook, then feel free to start the conversation on your own Instagram and tag us at the Connected Yoga Teacher, or leave a comment in the show notes. That's theconnectedyogateacher.com/270, or send us a voice message. You can find that option on our homepage over at theconnectedyogateacher.com. Also, I have an ask for you. Have you left us a review yet? We love it when you do that. We love to hear from listeners. Tell us about your favorite episode, or what you like about the show, or tell us what you think we can do better in some way. That's also allowed as a review. So go to the show notes page and click on leave a review. There's a button there. Or you can also do this through iTunes. We make it a goal to try and read each and every review on the podcast. So tell us who you are, where you're teaching, and what is the work that you do, so we can give you a shout out. All of the links and notes are over on our website for you. So if you're thinking, oh, I wanted to go back and listen to that one part, we have clickable timestamps on our website. It's really an amazing feature. It's something that I love as a podcast listener. You can find all of that over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/270 for today's episode. If you are wanting to hang out together in the next few months, the best place to find me right now is over at Pelvic Health Professionals. That's our membership site for anyone who's working with someone with a pelvis who wants to learn more. Each and every month, we do a business Q&A call. That's where I answer all member questions in an hour-long call. And you also have access to the replays for all of those. We also hire a guest expert each and every month. We pay the guest expert and we compile all of your questions for that hour. In May, we're talking about gender-affirming surgery with Dr. Christy Butler. In June, we're talking about bowel health with Michelle Lyons. In July, we're learning from Leslie Howard all about energetics of the pelvis. And then in August, Dr. Rose Schlaff is coming in and talking to us about desire and libido. If you want to join Pelvic Health Professionals and learn from these guest experts, or check out previous guest experts and the topics that we've covered, head over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com, and we'll also link directly to our guest expert page in our show notes. And because you've listened all the way to the end, I have two things to share. One is that we have a big update in our house. As of today, for the very first day, Sage, our youngest, headed off on her own with her full driver's license, going to work by herself. The level of excitement and giddy nervousness was so sweet this morning. She just couldn't believe that now she gets to drive by herself. And she's just going through vocalizing how exciting it is to be able to have this freedom to go anywhere. And so that was new in our house today. I also wanted to tell you that next week on the podcast, I am so excited that you get to meet a really dear friend of mine, Barb Elias, and we are going to talk all about bone health and yoga. I cannot wait until you get to hear this, because if you have not met Barb already, she's the person I always want to go and geek out with about how humans work, body, mind, and spirit. Barb is the person that I call when I'm like, hey, I have these questions about life or about the human body or about how our brain or our body works. And so I'm excited that you get to meet her. Thank you to our team over here who is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to put this together. Suzanne does the magic with all the audio. Crunch writes for us, and she's amazing at it. And Sinead is our community support manager. Thank you so much to all of you for bringing this episode to our Connected Yoga teachers. Thank you also to you, dear listener, for being here all the way to the end, for really diving in today and learning about hypermobility and how we can help students when they might be more bendy than the average body. I'd like to leave you with a question. I would love to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community, so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?